Eli sat quietly in his small, humble house, looking at the flames flickering in the fireplace. His mind wandered to his son, Ben, who had left for the city years ago in search of work. Eli missed him deeply, but never showed it. Life on the farm was quiet, and the days passed slowly. Every now and then, he would wonder if Ben was doing okay. He hadn't heard from him in a long time. Lena, his wife, was busy preparing dinner. She moved gracefully around their small kitchen, humming a soft tune. She had always been the heart of their home, managing everything with patience and care. Still, even she couldn't hide her concern for Ben. She had written to him a few times, but the letters never seemed to reach him. Just as Eli was about to pour himself some tea, there was a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. The postman had arrived. Eli rushed to the door, and the postman handed him an envelope. It was addressed in a neat hand with a familiar name, Ben. "This is from your son," the postman said with a smile. "He's written to you." Eli held the letter with trembling hands. His heart raced as he looked at the familiar handwriting. "Ben," he whispered. Lena quickly walked over. "Is it from him? What does he say?" Her voice was filled with hope. Eli opened the letter carefully, but his hands shook. He was eager to read the words, but the problem was that he couldn't read. He had never learned. The small village they lived in didn't have a school, and he had never needed to read or write much in his life. He had always relied on others. Lena looked over his shoulder. "Maybe we can ask Mr. Carter," she suggested. "He can read and write. He's the only one in the village who knows how." Eli nodded. "Let's go to him." They both knew that Mr. Carter, the village teacher, would help them. The next morning, Eli woke up early. He had made up his mind to go to the city and collect the money Ben had sent. The letter had said there was a money order enclosed, something Eli had never seen before, but it was important. Eli needed that money to help with the farm. Lena kissed him gently on the cheek before he left. "Be careful, Eli. The city is a big place. You don't know what to expect." "I'll be fine," Eli assured her, though he wasn't sure himself. He was a simple man, used to life on the farm. The busy streets of the city were a world he didn't know. Eli packed a small bag with some food, water, and a few coins. He started walking down the dirt road that led out of the village. The road seemed long, but Eli was determined. He wasn't used to traveling far, and the thought of the long journey made him feel uneasy. After walking for a few hours, he finally reached the bus stop. The bus was old and crowded. The people inside didn't notice Eli as he climbed aboard, and the bus began its long trip to Lakeside City. As they traveled, Eli looked out the window, amazed at the change in the landscape. The countryside gave way to fields of buildings and paved streets. He had never seen anything like it. The city felt so big, and Eli felt so small in it. The bus finally stopped in front of the post office, and Eli stepped out, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Eli stepped into the post office, feeling both excited and nervous. The walls were high, and the air smelled different, of paper and ink. There were so many people, all moving quickly. Eli didn't know what to do or where to go. His eyes scanned the room, looking for someone who could help him. At the counter stood a man in a dark uniform. Eli approached him cautiously, holding the letter in his hands. "I need to collect a money order," Eli said, his voice soft. "My son, Ben, sent me money." The man looked at him blankly. "Do you have an identity card?" he asked. Eli frowned. "Identity card? I don't understand." The official sighed, as though it was obvious. "You need an identity card to collect money. You don't have one?" Eli shook his head, unsure of what to do. "No, I don't have one." The official raised an eyebrow. "Well, you can't get the money without one. Go to the office across the street and apply for an identity card. Next." Eli stood there for a moment, feeling lost. He hadn't expected this. The rules of the city were so different from life in Green Hollow. He left the post office and headed toward the other office, hoping he could get the card he needed. The office Eli was directed to was another large building. Inside, people were waiting in long lines. Eli felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know how long it would take or what he had to do. After what felt like hours, it was finally Eli's turn. The clerk behind the desk looked at him with impatience. "Name?" the clerk asked in a sharp tone. Eli swallowed. "Eli," he said quietly. "Eli from Green Hollow." The clerk glanced at him and sighed. "You need a photo for your identity card. Go across the street to the photographer." Eli nodded slowly. He didn't understand why everything was so complicated, but he had to follow the rules. He had no choice. He walked across the street to a small photography shop. The photographer, a tall man with short, dark hair, was busy with another customer. When the man noticed Eli, he looked him up and down. "What do you need?" the photographer asked, his voice cold. "I need a photo for an identity card," Eli explained. The photographer grumbled. "That'll cost extra. You have money?" Eli nodded, though he wasn't sure if he had enough. The photographer led him to a chair and took a quick photo. Eli sat there awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. When Eli returned to the photographer the next day to collect the photos, the price was much higher than he had expected. The photographer demanded more money than Eli had, and for a moment, Eli felt his frustration rise. But he didn't want to argue. He handed over the coins he had and left. Eli returned to Green Hollow with no money in hand. His heart was heavy as he walked down the familiar dirt road, feeling defeated. He had tried, but the city's rules were confusing, and the people seemed so harsh. He couldn't understand why everything was so difficult. When Eli reached home, Lena was waiting for him. She looked at him with concern as he walked in, his shoulders slumped. "I couldn't get the money," Eli said, his voice thick with disappointment. "There were too many rules. I don't understand what they want from me." Lena took his hand and gave him a gentle smile. "It's okay, Eli. You tried. That's all that matters." The villagers heard about Eli's troubles, and many of them gathered to offer their support. Mr. Carter, the village teacher, approached Eli with a kind smile. "Maybe it's time to learn to read and write," Mr. Carter suggested. "Then you won't be caught in a situation like this again." Eli felt a flicker of hope. Maybe learning to read could help him in the future. He agreed to start lessons with Mr. Carter. A few weeks later, Eli returned to the city. This time, he was ready. He had learned a little about reading and writing from Mr. Carter, and he was determined to not let anything stop him. When he arrived at the post office, he handed over the money order from Ben, only to be told that it had expired. Eli's heart sank. How could the money order be expired? He felt lost and confused. Why would Ben send him something that couldn't be used? In the midst of his frustration, Eli decided to seek help. Mr. Carter had told him about a man named Mr. Thomas, who might be able to help with these kinds of problems. Eli found his way to Mr. Thomas's office, a small, tidy space on the edge of the city. Mr. Thomas listened carefully to Eli's story. He explained that the money order was too old and couldn't be processed. But he also told Eli that he could give him a small amount of money as a gift, just to help him. Eli felt a mix of emotions. He didn't want charity, but he also didn't want to go home empty-handed. After much thought, Eli accepted the offer. Eli walked back to his humble village, feeling defeated. The city had been too overwhelming, too complicated for him to understand. He didn't want to let Lena or anyone else see how discouraged he felt, but it was hard to hide the disappointment in his eyes. The money that Ben had sent seemed so far out of reach now. He had tried everything he could, but the systems in the city were built for people who knew their way around, not for someone like him. That night, as he sat by the fire with Lena, the warmth of the flames did little to ease the cold feeling in his chest. Lena was already in bed, but Eli couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, thinking of the way people had looked at him in the city. He had felt so small, like he was invisible. Then, just as he was about to give in to his frustration, he remembered something Mr. Carter had said. "There's a man in the city named Mr. Thomas. He's someone who might be able to help you." Eli wasn't sure what Mr. Thomas could do, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. He got up quietly from his chair, grabbed his coat, and decided he would return to the city the next day. He couldn't rest until he had done everything possible to bring that money back to Lena and the farm. The next morning, Eli set out once again on the long journey to the city. He took the bus, his thoughts filled with worry and hope. The city seemed even more intimidating this time, but Eli was determined. He was ready to face whatever came next, as long as it meant he could help his family. When Eli arrived at Mr. Thomas's office, he was greeted by a warm, friendly man. Mr. Thomas had a kind face and a calm voice, and he listened patiently as Eli explained everything that had happened. "I'm sorry about the trouble with the money order," Mr. Thomas said after hearing Eli's story. "It's a difficult situation, but don't worry. We'll try to find a solution." Eli couldn't believe it. For the first time since he had come to the city, someone was treating him like he wasn't just a simple farmer. Mr. Thomas spoke to him with respect, with care. It felt like a weight was lifted off Eli's shoulders. Mr. Thomas explained that the money order Eli had tried to cash was no longer valid because it had expired. He explained it all clearly, so Eli could understand, though he still felt frustrated. Why had Ben sent him money that wouldn't work? Despite this, Mr. Thomas offered Eli a gift. "I know this is hard, but I can give you some money to help you get by, just this once." Eli hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting help from anyone. But Mr. Thomas had been kind, and Eli was starting to realize that there was no shame in asking for help when you needed it. Eli accepted the offer, though it filled him with a sense of discomfort. He didn't want to feel like he was taking charity, but at the same time, he knew he needed to take what was offered. "Thank you," Eli said softly, his voice full of gratitude. "I didn't know what I was going to do." Mr. Thomas smiled. "It's not charity, Eli. It's just helping someone who needs it." Eli returned to Green Hollow with mixed emotions. The city had been a challenge, but there was something reassuring about the simple life he had at home. He had learned that the world beyond his village was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. But now he understood a little bit more. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. When he arrived back at the village, Lena was waiting for him by the door. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the relief. Eli walked toward her, the small amount of money Mr. Thomas had given him tucked in his coat. "I didn't get the money Ben sent," Eli said quietly, but Lena could see the strength in his eyes. "But I did learn something. I learned that things aren't as simple as we think, but with help from others, we can get through." Lena's eyes softened, and she embraced him. "I'm proud of you, Eli. You tried your best." The villagers gathered around Eli, and they all listened carefully to his story. They were sympathetic, but they also saw Eli's growth. Mr. Carter, who had been teaching Eli to read and write, was proud of his progress. "We'll all help you, Eli," Mr. Carter said. "Let's work together to make sure you don't face these struggles again." Eli's heart warmed at the thought of the villagers coming together to help. They had always been there for each other, but now Eli felt a stronger connection with everyone. Maybe it was time for him to learn more about the world outside, so he could be ready for whatever came next. Some weeks later, Eli received another letter from Ben. This time, the letter was different. It wasn't just news about how Ben was doing. It was a promise. Ben had sent a new money order, one that was valid, and everything seemed to be in order. Eli's heart swelled with relief as he opened the letter and saw the new money order inside. It wasn't much compared to what he had hoped for, but it was enough to help the farm for a while. The money wasn't just a lifeline. It was a symbol of Ben's love and support for his parents. Eli knew what he had to do. He packed his bags once again, but this time he felt more confident. He had learned from his past mistakes. He had learned to read a little, and he had learned that asking for help was okay. Armed with this knowledge, he was ready to go back to the city and make sure the money order went through without any trouble. When Eli reached the post office, he felt more prepared. He handed over the money order, and this time, everything went smoothly. The clerk took the money order, processed it, and handed Eli the cash. Eli could hardly believe it. He had done it. He returned to Green Hollow, carrying the money and a sense of pride. He wasn't just a simple farmer anymore. He was a man who had learned, who had grown, and who had persevered in the face of many challenges. Back in Green Hollow, Eli felt different. He had learned so much about the world outside his village, and he had learned so much about himself. He wasn't the same man who had left the village months ago. He was stronger, wiser, and more confident. And with the support of his community, Eli knew he could face anything that came his way. Eli thanked Mr. Carter for all his help, and he promised to continue learning. He understood now that life wasn't just about the work you did on the farm. It was about learning, growing, and helping others. And with that, he felt more connected to the world around him. The village celebrated when Eli returned with the money. It wasn't just about the money itself. It was about the journey, the lessons learned, and the sense of community that had made everything possible. And as Eli sat by the fire with Lena, the warmth from the flames seemed to reach deeper into his heart. He no longer felt isolated. He had found his place in the world, and he knew that, with the support of those around him, anything was possible.